Hi, this is Becky Schmuck, and I'm just going to go over some of the differences and similarities between the 504 and the IEP. So, from a governing standpoint, the 504 is actually a part of a Rehabilitation Act of 1973 versus the IEP is actually governed by Disabilities Education Act of 2004. They're both governed by the U.S. Department of Education. However, it's the Office of Civil Rights for the 504 and the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services for the IEP. The 504 applies for a human their entire life versus the IEP is only age coverage up until birth, from birth until the age of 21. Students must have a disability for both of them, but it's very specific with the IEP. So specific to 504, they must have a disability, and the disability must affect the student's ability to access the curriculum. Versus the IEP has 13 very specific categories. And those categories must actually affect a child's ability to access the curriculum. Okay. The 504 does not require a written plan, but the IEP does. Evaluation, the law does not specify like an evaluation period or processes, procedures for 504, but there is so for the IEP. So one thing I do know with my son right now, we're going through this process, and they have to have 2 SST appointments, and essentially they evaluate and do some goals, and they're set about 6 to 8 weeks apart. And then on that third appointment, if they don't see a quote unquote improvement in certain set goals, that's when they'll, essentially access the next level to put an IEP plan in place. I do know that it is much, much easier to access the 504 plans. It's like set aside money that each school is given, I believe at the federal, but it could be state level. I have to look into that again. But the IEP is much more challenging to get. And even if your child does have one of the 13 disabilities, it does not mean that they are going to qualify for an IEP. It has to do with performance and how much it's affecting the student. I think also, honestly, disrupting the classroom in some ways. So it's just with tight funding, I know that it's a lot harder to access IEP, and you have to be very diligent as a parent and tracking records. I also do know if you can get an evaluation outside, so from a medical doctor, specifically like no, it's ADHD. They don't do ADD. It's just ADHD. It's like 90 some odd percent. At least this is in California. That's the number one process to really get the ball rolling for potentially establishing an IEP with that particular one. But things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, I'm going to butcher that one, that is a lot harder to get services for. Speech is the easiest to get services for with an IEP, but they're very, very specific. Just breaking down a little bit more, parents have to be involved with an IEP. They do not with a 504. They are evaluated on IEP every 3 years, so making sure that they still qualify, quote unquote. However, I've heard from parents that once you have an IEP, never to let it go, that they will often, schools and districts will want to try to get off. But if you really feel your student has the need for services, that you need to hold on to it really tight. Versus the 504 is something that the school must get permission and evaluate, but they don't require parent participation. There's a lot more rights covered for parents and students under the IEP. And the goal must be written and measured must have written and measured for the IEP, but that is not true for the 504. And then students must be given, so this is interesting for accommodations. So students may be given accommodation to equal the playing field, so to say, with a 504. Versus an IEP, students may be given accommodations to make it easier to access their education. Curriculum does not necessarily need to be changed. In fact, in a 504, it's not changed. The curriculum is not modified, but it could be modified or potentially altered for someone who has an IEP. And then services are provided for IEP, but they are not for 504. Colleges do not have IEPs. So anyone who's in college will only have a 504. I shouldn't say only, but if you had an IEP up till then, now you only have a 504. And then resources, parents have rights to file complaints with the Office of Civil Rights for a 504, but specific mediation and due process procedures can be followed up through registering and complaints with the IEP. So overall, my personal experience has been our first did not quite qualify for an IEP. And at the end of the day, she sort of aged out, I should say, of some of her learning, her disability, which was anxiety related. So it has to be quite severe in order to honestly get an IEP. Our son is more of a true, tried and true. He ADD, but he definitely has dyslexia. So it's just a slow and steady process. And the earlier you can get an IEP for students, the better. So as a teacher, we really need to be aware and advocating for our students because it's going up against the system. And so especially for the primary grade levels, it's much easier if you can get everything documented. It all comes down to documentation and get it done as soon as possible. I'm seeing and hearing it seems to be like it needs to be a benchmark of almost 2 years academic delay, which is crazy because that means kids aren't really getting IEPs until they are, at least 7, but really like 3rd grade, which misses so much. So you really have to be persistent and work with your principal. You have to work with your teachers as a parent, but teachers really just need to document everything in order to get their students these services. That's it.